Imagine waking up in a world where your shadow doesn't follow you, but instead, it walks a few feet ahead of you, leading the way like it knows something you don't. You've probably spent your whole life believing that certain things are just true, that gravity pulls down, that yesterday comes before today, and that a glass shatters only after it hits the floor. But what if I told you there was a place where all of those rules were thrown into the trash? Today, we're going to step into a story that doesn't just break the rules of logic. It acts like those rules never existed in the first place. This isn't just a weird tale. It's a journey into a city called Ouroboros, and by the time we reach the end, you might start questioning if the chair you're sitting on is actually there, or if it's just a very convincing idea. Welcome to Ouroboros. At first glance, it looks like any other town you might find on a map, but the longer you stay, the more you realize that something is deeply, fundamentally wrong. In Ouroboros, the sun rises in the east and sets in the east. Shadows don't stretch away from the light. They lean toward it, as if they're trying to warm themselves up. This is the home of a man named Arthur Penhaligon. Now, Arthur is not the kind of guy who likes surprises. He's a mathematician. He's the kind of person who organizes his spice rack by the molecular weight of the ingredients. He believes in proofs, equations, and the absolute certainty that 1 + 1 will always equal 2. For Arthur, logic isn't just a tool, it's his security blanket. He moved to Ouroboros because the rent was cheap, but he quickly realized he was living in a nightmare of irrationality. One afternoon, Arthur was sitting in his kitchen, staring at a glass of water on the edge of the table. He was calculating the exact amount of force it would take for a breeze to knock it over. Suddenly, the glass didn't fall. Instead, the sound of glass shattering filled the room. A second later, Arthur watched as the glass actually slid off the table and hit the floor. The effect happened before the cause. It was like the universe had a bad internet connection and the audio was out of sync with the video. Most people would scream or run out of the house. But Arthur? He just sat there with a stopwatch, trying to figure out the time delay. He didn't realize that this was just the beginning. In Ouroboros, the citizens have what you might call normalized absurdity. You'll see a woman walking a dog, but the dog is actually a cloud on a leash. You'll see a man painting a fence with invisible ink, and the fence actually disappears. Nobody questions it. They just go about their day, nodding at the impossible as if it were a common rainstorm. Arthur felt like the only sane person in an asylum where the walls were made of jelly. The real trouble started with a phone call. Arthur's phone rang, and when he looked at the caller ID, his own name popped up. He answered it, thinking it was some kind of prank or a glitch in the system. But the voice on the other end was unmistakably his own. It wasn't a recording. It was Arthur, sounding out of breath and incredibly stressed. The voice said, "Arthur, listen to me. In exactly 10 minutes, you're going to find a blue umbrella under your bed. Do not open it inside the house. If you do, the beginning will happen, and we can't have that." Arthur looked at the clock. Then he looked at his phone. The call had come from 10 minutes in the future. Now, if you're a math guy like Arthur, this ruins your whole week. He spent the next 9 minutes and 59 seconds arguing with himself about the impossibility of retrocausality. But sure enough, at the 10-minute mark, he looked under his bed. There it was, a bright blue umbrella that definitely wasn't there when he vacuumed that morning. This is where the story gets really strange. Arthur didn't just ignore the umbrella. He decided he was going to solve Ouroboros. He was going to use his pens, his rulers, and his compasses to map out the insanity and find the logic hidden underneath. He started by trying to measure his living room. He'd measure the north wall and get 12 feet. Then he'd turn around, measure the south wall, and get 42 miles. Every time he looked away, the room changed its mind about how big it wanted to be. He realized that in this city, geometry was just a suggestion. To find answers, Arthur went to the local library. But this wasn't a normal library. This was the library of unwritten books. The archivist, a man whose skin looked like old parchment and who claimed to remember things that wouldn't happen for another 3 years, greeted him at the door. The archivist told Arthur that books in Ouroboros don't have ink on the pages until someone looks at them. Even weirder, the story in the book changes based on who is reading it. Arthur picked up a book titled The History of the Future. When he opened it, the pages were blank. As he stared, Words began to crawl across the paper like tiny black ants. The book started describing Arthur's childhood, the time he fell off his bike, the way his first-grade teacher smelled like peppermint and chalk. But then, the words changed. They started describing how Arthur felt right then, confused, annoyed, and slightly hungry. The book was reading him as much as he was reading the book. The archivist laughed and told him that in Ouroboros, information doesn't flow from the past to the present. It flows from the heart to the world. Arthur realized that his biology was starting to flip out too. He noticed that he wasn't hungry after he ate a big meal. Instead, he would feel incredibly full all morning, and then, right before dinner, he would suddenly feel like he hadn't eaten in weeks. His body was reacting to the food he was going to eat, not the food he had already consumed. It was like living his life in reverse, but only in certain ways. Arthur's investigation led him to the center of the city, to a place the locals called the Void Spot. This was a small park where gravity decided to take a holiday. If you walked into the Void Spot, you didn't fall down, you fell sideways. People were walking on the sides of buildings as if they were sidewalks. Arthur tried to use his compass to find north, but the needle just spun around and around, eventually pointing straight up at the sky. As he stood there, trying to make sense of the horizontal gravity, he tried to ask a passing woman for directions. But when he opened his mouth, the words didn't make sense anymore. He tried to say, "Which way is the town square?" But what came out was, "Which yellow is the square triangle?" The woman nodded and replied, "The blue is very yes today." Language was breaking down. In Ouroboros, words were losing their fixed meanings. If everyone decides that yes means blue, then that's what it means until someone else decides it means bicycle. For a man like Arthur, who lived for precise definitions, this was the ultimate insult. He felt like his brain was being scrubbed with steel wool. He was losing his grip on reality because the reality he lived in had no grip to begin with. Things went from weird to worse when Arthur was arrested. His crime? Trying to make sense of things. Apparently, in Ouroboros, trying to find a logical explanation for an anomaly is considered a high crime. It's seen as a form of mental pollution. They took him to a courtroom that looked like it was designed by a kid who had seen a picture of a court once, but didn't really understand how they worked. The judge sat on a floating chair that was 20 feet in the air. The jury consisted of 3 cats, a toaster, and a very confused-looking bush. Arthur tried to defend himself. He talked about the laws of thermodynamics. He talked about the Pythagorean theorem. He tried to explain that the glass shattering before it fell was a physical impossibility. The judge looked down at him, or rather, looked at the floor while speaking to Arthur, and said, "The evidence is clear. The defendant has tried to apply reasons to the unreasonable. Does the defense have any socks to present?" Arthur was confused. Socks? What do socks have to do with physics? The judge sighed. Exactly. Guilty. The judge ruled that Arthur was guilty because his socks were gray, and gray is a very logical color. As punishment, Arthur was sent to the prison of infinity. The prison of infinity was a room with no doors and no windows. It was just a white cube. Arthur spent what felt like years in there, but when he looked at his watch, only 3 seconds had passed. He realized that time wasn't moving forward, it was just vibrating in place. He tried to find a way out, but there was nothing to push against. Then he remembered something the archivist had said, "The world is what you think it is." Arthur realized that the only reason he was in a prison was because he believed in the concept of a prison. He believed that walls stop people. He took a deep breath and decided to stop believing in the wall in front of him. He didn't just try to walk through it. He convinced himself that he was already on the other side. And just like that, he was standing in the middle of the town square. This was his big epiphany. Logic isn't a law of the universe. It's just a habit. It's a shortcut our brains use so we don't have to think too hard about how weird everything is. Humans invented logic to make the world feel safe and predictable, but Ouroboros was showing him what happens when that safety blanket is ripped away. The universe isn't a math problem. It's a dream that we're all having at the same time. Arthur knew he had to reach the source of the chaos. He headed for the clock tower of Zero, a massive stone tower that stood at the very edge of the city. Legend had it that this was where the heart of the illogic resided. Arthur started climbing the stairs. He climbed for hours, his legs burning, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He must have climbed 1,000 flights of stairs. But when he looked out a window, he saw he was in the basement. He tried going down the stairs, and suddenly he was near the top. To get higher, he had to go lower. To move forward, he had to walk backward. He finally reached the top chamber, and there he met the architect of chaos. The architect wasn't a monster or a god. He was just a guy in a bathrobe, sitting in a reclining chair, eating a bowl of cereal that was floating in midair. When Arthur looked closer, he realized the architect looked exactly like him. It was another Arthur, but this one looked relaxed, happy, and completely unbothered by the fact that the room was currently turning into a giant strawberry. The architect explained that Ouroboros wasn't a glitch in the world. It was a place where the human subconscious was allowed to run wild. You spent your whole life trying to box the world into equations, Arthur, the other self said. But the world is too big for boxes. You're the one who created this city because, deep down, you were bored of things making sense. You wanted a challenge you couldn't solve. The architect told Arthur that to save reality, he had to perform an act that was both possible and impossible at the same time. If he succeeded, the logic would return. If he failed, Ouroboros would spread until the whole world became a dream where nothing stayed the same for more than a second. Arthur thought about it. What is both possible and impossible? He looked at the blue umbrella he was still carrying, the one his future self told him not to open. Opening an umbrella is possible, but opening an umbrella to stop it from raining inside a room where there is no rain, that's a bit more complicated. Arthur realized the answer wasn't in a math book. He walked to the center of the room, held the umbrella up, and said, "I believe it is raining." Even though the sun was shining through the windows and the room was dry, he chose to believe in a lie so hard that it became true. Suddenly, a downpour started right there in the chamber. Then, he opened the umbrella. In that moment, he was protecting himself from a rainstorm that he himself had created out of nothing. It was a perfect loop of a logic. He was the cause and the effect. He was the problem and the solution. The contradiction was so powerful that the world began to shake. The city of Ouroboros began to fold in on itself. The buildings turned into paper and drifted away. The horizontal gravity snapped back to vertical, sending people tumbling to the ground. The colors bled out of the sky until everything was a blinding, pure white. Arthur felt himself falling, but he wasn't scared. He had finally let go of the need for things to make sense. When he woke up, he was back in his kitchen. He was sitting at his table, and the glass of water was right where it should be. He checked the time. It was the same afternoon he had started this whole journey. He looked around for the blue umbrella, but it was gone. He felt a sense of relief. The world was normal again. 1 + 1 = 2. Gravity pulled things down. But then he looked at the table. There was a letter sitting there, addressed to him. He opened it and realized it was written in his own handwriting. It was a list of all the things he had seen in Ouroboros: the archivist, the horizontal gravity, the socks-based trial. At the bottom of the letter, it said, "Don't get too comfortable. Logic is just a story we tell ourselves, so we don't have to admit that we're all just floating in the middle of nowhere." Arthur looked out the window. The sun was rising in the east, just like it was supposed to. But the sun was a bright, vivid shade of purple. He smiled, picked up his glass of water, and took a drink. It tasted like blue. So, what do we take away from a story like this? Maybe the point isn't that logic is bad, or that we should all start believing in purple suns. Maybe the point is that our brains are incredibly powerful at creating a sense of order, even when the world around us is messy and unpredictable. We like to think we have everything figured out, that we understand the rules of life, but every now and then, something happens that we can't explain. A coincidence that's too perfect to be random. A dream that comes true. A feeling of déjà vu that makes you feel like you've lived this moment before. When those things happen, we usually try to brush them off with logic. We say, "Oh, it's just a fluke," or "I'm just tired." But maybe, just maybe, those are the moments where the real world, the one without the safety blanket of logic, is peeking through. Arthur Penhaligon started as a man who needed the world to be a math problem. He ended as a man who realized that the most beautiful parts of life are the parts that don't add up. the parts that defy explanation,